Hello there, welcome back to another edition of Inde-Car on the 23rd of April. Now, there's an old saying which in Scots says, if you're marching, you're no fighting. And this usually was meant to mean that if you were not engaged in actual combat, but you were marching, you were still heading in the right direction, even if you weren't actually fighting. And so, does this hold true nowadays? Well, actually no, because we saw a lot of marching over the weekend. In fact, on Saturday, the Believe in Scotland march attracted thousands of people onto the streets of Glasgow. Now, according to the unionist media, over the last few days, this particular event had, as they put it, a disappointing turnout. And they claimed that there were some 2,000 people who actually took part in the march and a rally at Freedom Square, formerly known as George Square in Glasgow. Now, I think, having watched many of the videos that were taken of the procession and the march itself as it made its way from the west end of Glasgow, from Kelvin Way through to George Square, that looked to me like a lot more than 2,000 people. Now, if you're a football fan like me, you'll be used to sort of gauging the size of crowds, particularly when they are either going into or leaving a football stadium, and from my estimation it looked like at least twice that number were marching on the streets of Glasgow on Saturday. It could well have been even more than that, because people join marches along the route. They don't just start at the beginning and stay there till the end. And as you're probably aware, there was an alarming event midway through the march when a car appeared from a left-hand side street as the march was crossing an intersection in the city centre, and appeared to accelerate towards the crowd, only being stopped, incidentally, by a guy I thought was a particularly brave police officer who stood his ground and actually put his body in the way of this accelerating vehicle as it headed towards the crowd, who were still crossing the junction. There have been some reports that this was a drunk driver. The police, I believe, have arrested and detained a man for driving whilst under the influence of either drugs or alcohol, or possibly both. But they claim that there was no connection between this man and his actions and the march itself. It may well be that this is just a simple coincidence, but if you watch the video footage as I did, it looked like a very deliberate acceleration through both a red light and straight at a serving police officer who was actually instructing the driver to stop at the time. And it did look deliberate, despite the fact that it's now emerged that this may well simply have been just a drunk driver who took a wrong turning somewhere. Anyway, the upshot of all of this is that the marching season is upon us, and the opening march saw great weather. It also, I think, importantly saw the First Minister of Scotland at the head of the march, right at front and centre. Humza Yousaf has taken an awful lot of flack recently for all kinds of different things. The Scottish Government, in its alliance with the Green Party, has had all kinds of abuse thrown at it for the various unpopular legislation which has been enacted largely at the insistence of the Green Party, which was their price for going into coalition with the SNP. And I'll come back to that topic in a moment or two. But it was interesting, first of all, to see so many leaders of political parties at the front of that group. I also noticed Ross Greer in the background as well as various actors. In fact, if I remember correctly, Martin Compston was standing right next to Humza Yousaf. For the first time, actually, watching Humza Yousaf on that march, it's the first time I've seen him actually look relaxed and happy for the first time in his premiership, I think. And I think perhaps maybe he should take some comfort from that, and perhaps if he's developed a taste for actually campaigning for independence, maybe he'll start to throw more of his energies into that instead of unpopular pieces of legislation which nobody wanted except the Green Party. And I suspect that also this issue where the Greens are currently threatening to leave their coalition with the SNP as being a watershed moment actually for Scottish politics. I think to draw a line under what has happened to the Scottish Government in the last year or so, in fact maybe a little bit longer than that, is that the compromises made with the Greens have cost the SNP a lot of its popularity at the polling booth. And despite the fact that the British media is claiming that all of these pieces of spurious or unnecessary or unpopular legislation have caused support for independence to drop. This is what they're claiming, and the SNP's vote is plunging, and they're producing all kinds of worrying-looking polls showing that the SNP is hemorrhaging support to the Labour Party. Remember, they do this every election. The British media produces all kinds of homemade polls which they commission from their own companies. And remember, companies like YouGov, I mean, clearly the message is in the title there, YouGov. It's a government branch, basically, claiming that the SNP is going to lose multiple seats at the next UK general election. But I would point out that the next general election that's coming up this year, no matter when it's held, has absolutely zero effect on the independence movement whatsoever. This is simply a UK general election where Scottish parties are competing for 57 seats, which has absolutely no effect on anything that's done in the British Parliament whatsoever, other than the fact that if we get a lot of independence MPs, they're going to make a lot of noise, they're going to stand up, and the usual abuse and jeering are going to try and make their voices heard above the clamour. But nothing really is going to happen politically as a result of this general election. So I'm not really worried about that. The newspapers are also making a great deal of the fact that the Greens are clutching their pearls at the moment and worrying about whether or not they should be in a coalition with the SNP at all. Frankly, there's two things strike me about this. One is that Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvie don't want to lose their enormous salaries or the political power that they've enjoyed for the last few years, simply because they are unpopular. I mean, the politicians do this all the time. But if the Green Party does vote to end its coalition with the SNP and the so-called Butte House Agreement is torn up, what does it mean for Scottish politics? Would it have any effect? Well, actually, no. Simply the SNP would form a minority government, which, although technically would not have an overweening majority in the House at Holyrood, would not really affect much at all, because both the Greens and various other small independent MSPs would still vote with the Scottish Government when it came to issues concerning Scotland's independence. And despite the Greens not being in a coalition and not being able to hold the SNP to ransom and force them into accepting these unpopular and sometimes unnecessary pieces of legislation, and I'm thinking here about the Gender Recognition Reform Act, I'm also thinking about the so-called ban on wood-burning stoves, but only in certain places and only in new builds and so on. All of these confusing and easily targeted pieces of legislation have proved to be immensely unpopular and an easy target for the unionist media. Now, it also brings me to an interesting observation, and that is the other thing that the British media is focusing all its guns on at the moment is Peter Murrell. Now, Peter Murrell is married, obviously, to Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister, who very famously sent the question of whether the Scottish Parliament should have the power to legislate for an independence referendum to the Supreme Court, and tasked the actual job of this to, I think, one of the most inept Lord Advocates that I've ever seen, to ask this question, knowing full well that the Supreme Court was going to say, nah, you can't have an independence referendum. Scottish Parliament doesn't have that power. We all know the Scottish Parliament doesn't have that power anyway, because it's a devolved administration. So it was always a foregone conclusion that that would happen. Anyway, back to the point. Peter Murrell, okay, he's been arrested and he's been charged with alleged embezzlement of party donations. I'm assuming that they're referring to the £600,000 which is allegedly missing from the SNP's accounts. Now, I say allegedly missing, it is actually missing, and the SNP have not been able to show where exactly it went, although it does seem to have been included in the general spending on the fight for independence, although not in any specific way. But Peter Murrell is accused of having embezzled that money. That's basically means stealing it. And they're going to have to present some evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service, or whatever they now call it, the British wing, if you like, of the judiciary in Scotland, as well as the Procurator Fiscal's office. Now, most people don't realise that the highest court in the land, the High Judiciary of Scotland, has UK oversight bearing down on it all the time. We don't have a fully independent judiciary. This is a bit of a myth. Our legal systems are separate, but when it comes to big, I would say, media cases, what we used to call in America high jingo cases, where there are public figures involved, when it comes to that, the British state has a sort of casting vote when it comes to prosecuting. So Peter Murrell may well end up in court faced with charges where he's going to have to prove himself innocent, or the state is, more importantly, going to have to present compelling evidence that he isn't. Either way, the British media expects this to have a catastrophic effect on the SNP. In fact, they think it already is. And if you're anything like me and you surf the internet and you have the misfortune to stray onto X, you'll see nothing but British trolls. Fake accounts, bot accounts, people in England, all mocking and jeering and thinking it's all over for independence in Scotland. And you'd be be forgiven for thinking that we might have lost this. But actually, we haven't. This is just a lot of noise and fury. The British think they've got us on the ropes. The English government thinks that independence is dead and that we can't function. Far from it. Anyway, the real fight is yet to come, and the real fight will not come until 2026, because that is when the Scottish general election will be. And it's at that point that we have the opportunity to get our independence back. And only by using that general election, I suspect, can we do it. But in which case, how are we going to do it? The one thing that's been lacking all along from the SNP is a procedure which will result in independence actually happening, not just campaigning for it or making people believe in Scotland or making some kind of case for independence based on economics or based on something else. The fact of the matter is, it's not about any of those things. It's about righting an historic wrong, and that is that Scotland should never have been colonised by England in the first place. We weren't voluntarily entering into this union. We were coerced and forced into it virtually at gunpoint because the English state is bigger than the Scottish state, basically, and might is right, and we've ended up being subsumed into something we didn't want to be in. And now we're faced with trying to figure out a way of getting out of it after 300 and goodness knows how many years. However, we can get out of it, but we need to use the next Holyrood general election to do it. And never mind talking about de facto referendums. This isn't going to be a referendum. This is going to be electing a government in Holyrood whose sole aim is to basically to accept the Scottish Constitution and reaffirm Scotland's sovereignty to decide its own fate, and basically say, if you vote for us, then we will declare independence. We will make Scotland independent. We're not just going to negotiate with the United Kingdom. We're actually going to get our independence. You will be voting for independence, not just for the SNP to come back into power. And that needs to be clearly articulated to the electorate, that they're either voting for the union parties, and that would be a vote to stay in the UK, or they are voting for parties of independence, which will mean independence, which will mean the Scottish government saying the union is over, declaring an end to it, and starting the process of separating from the United Kingdom, however that is done. Okay, that brings me to one final thing today. I had an interesting email this morning, and completely unexpectedly I got an email from an editor of one of the United Kingdom's defence magazines. Now in this he asked me about the claims I had made about my live broadcast being interfered with by some kind of jammer. Asked me how I knew that, wanted to know if I would be interviewed about it. And it surprised me actually that a defence journal would not know about covert surveillance anywhere in the UK, because it happens all the time. It has to. Not because they're desperately trying to prevent independence only, but simply because the security services in the United Kingdom are monitoring all sorts of radio chatter and communications in case there is any kind of terrorist threat. And I guess nobody would argue against that. However, my programmes were definitely interfered with. The sound on some of those broadcasts was being deliberately garbled and jammed by some local source. And I went to the bother and expense of buying some scanners, some radio frequency scanners, which would show me where this jamming signal was coming from, what direction it was coming from, and what the frequency was. And I know for a fact that there was a powerful radio transmitter somewhere nearby during those periods when the interference was happening. And it was somewhere within half a mile of me, and I could get a direction fix on it, although I may not be able to always see it. But there were occasionally vans present in those directions that looked pretty anonymous, looked like any old white van. Anyway, I got some confirmation of my suspicions from a former Scottish police chief who's now in retirement in the European Union, and told me that at any given time in Scotland there are at least 2 of these covert surveillance vehicles around. And they're basically looking for any kind of broadcasts or any kind of radio traffic which might pose a threat to the continued existence of the United Kingdom. Now, it depends on your definition of threat, I suppose. Maybe I pose a threat to the continued existence of the United Kingdom as we know it, but not in any terrorist sense. I'm simply broadcasting information to people that they may not know in support of a political independence for Scotland, which is arrived at democratically, so I'm hardly a terrorist. But that doesn't stop them from not liking what I'm saying. So I will probably speak to this magazine. I have already sent them some information about this. And I can't obviously reveal all my sources to them. But on the other hand, I've noticed that since doing these recorded programmes, obviously I'm not getting any interference on these because I'm not broadcasting outside of the car. I'm simply recording myself on the phone and then uploading it to various media platforms so that you can see it. Anyway, I think in the round today, I would say that don't be put off by all the noise and fury of the British state media. You're not going to hear any good news from them about Scotland's cause. However, there is a cause to support. But the next general election is not the place to fight it. The next general election is a sideshow. And whether the SNP do well or not doesn't actually matter at all. What matters really is what happens in 2026. And that is when all of these Scottish parties of independence desperately need to form an alliance which campaigns not for re-election as a government, but for a re-election as a government which will gain independence, and not just hang around and talk about it, but will actually say when they're elected, we are the government of Scottish independence, and we are now saying right now that the union is over, and we invite the United Kingdom to negotiate a nice peaceful end to the union and a new arrangement between the 2 independent countries of Scotland and England, which is to everybody's advantage, including in terms of things like defence, our collective defence of these islands, which still needs to happen, continued free trade and the movement of people across our common border, which is guaranteed anyway because there's a freedom of movement legislation in place in the United Kingdom anyway, and generally just renegotiating a settlement with England which we can all live with. And that would mean that Scotland can do what it wants after that, and our own elected officials will decide it. I wouldn't fear this. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to become independent, because it won't be. It might take a decade or so to sort everything out and disentangle everything from the United Kingdom system. But on the other hand, we have plenty of smart people in Scotland who are well capable of doing this. We just need them to be voted into government, and not the usual faces of the over-ambitious political wannabes who we sometimes see on our TV screens. We need some people who know what they're doing. Some people who are elder statesmen, perhaps some economists, some industrialists, but we also need trade unionists, we need workers, we need ordinary people, but we need people who are capable, and not just political wannabes who just want power and money. We need people who want to change the country, and that's going to be tricky. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you found today's programme interesting. Don't be put off by all this racket coming from the unionist press. This is them thinking it's all over. They're trying to convince us that it's all over. But you can't kill an idea. You can't kill the need for freedom. It never dies. It always is there. And the independence of Scotland is more popular now than it's ever been. And it's probably more popular than the SNP or the Green Party. So I wouldn't fear anything that happens at the general election. And I certainly wouldn't fear the Greens leaving their arrangement with the SNP and having a minority administration for a year or two until the next general election. It's not going to make a slightest bit of difference. Anyway, keep marching. Keep your packers up and keep the faith, because we will get our independence, but it's up to us to make sure we elect the people who are going to do it. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.